Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee, thank you for allowing me to testify here today. It is truly an honor and pleasure. My name is Mark Meckler. I'm the president of Convention of States Action. We are the national organization with over 5 million members that are responsible for moving this initiative forward across the country. The reason that we're moving this initiative forward and have been doing so for almost 8 years now is that the United States government is at a crisis point. And it's not a crisis that has come on quickly. It's a crisis of generational proportions. If you look at all of American history, all the way to Washington's first administration, the federal government has grown under every single administration with the exception of President Calvin Coolidge. So virtually every administration in American history has grown the federal government. This is something that the founders feared, and they designed a government against this possibility. They were worried about overreach of the federal government. You heard it discussed how Colonel George Mason rose and added this second clause of Article 5 that we're discussing today to put into the Constitution the idea that the states would have to push back against federal tyranny. They knew, it was obvious, and it wasn't because they had a crystal ball, it was because they understood human nature. Centralized governments, strong central governments, always centralize more power. It is the history of humanity for this to be so, and it is no different in the United States of America. Today, we're facing a long-term debt of approximately $29 trillion. Really, if you look at structural debt, the things that are off the books, the unfunded mandates and unfunded liabilities, that is now over $157 trillion. No one knows how much money that is. But what we can all be sure of is that it is an immoral and unethical and unconscionable burden placed upon our children, our children's children, and our posterity. The founders said this. It's as true today as it was then. Today, I come before you in support of a resolution that would have 3 subject matter areas be discussed at convention. First is anything that would propose term limits on federal officials. Second, anything that would impose fiscal restraints on government. And third is anything that would propose structure restraints, power and jurisdictional restraints on the federal government. I'd like to discuss each of those separately, if I might. I'd like to start with term limits. And you have essentially 2 term limits measures before you today. So I just wanted to make the distinction so that we can be a little bit clear here on what we're discussing. You have already passed a balanced budget resolution here in Wisconsin. We're now discussing a term limits resolution. Both of those are contained within SJR 8. So you have a chance to go to convention, discuss a balanced budget amendment, discuss term limits, and also discuss scope and jurisdictional limits. And I want to explain some of the differences in the term limits and why I think this is important. Generally speaking, as already testified to, the American people are fundamentally in support of term limits for members of Congress. We have broad experience with term limits in the United States. At least 23 states have term limits in place currently. There was an attempt to put term limits in place on the U.S. Congress. Unfortunately, the United States Supreme Court said we're not allowed to limit the terms of our congressional delegations. I say that with a bit of a smile because the Supreme Court has often overstepped its own jurisdiction and the reasonable bounds of the Constitution. I believe they did so in that case. We have that right and that ability. I think we should be very careful when imposing term limits, and we should do so in a structural way that also recognizes that there are other problems with people serving too long in the federal government. When you create term limits for people who are elected officials, but you do not also limit the terms of people who are staffers or bureaucrats, you empower what we've now commonly come to know as the deep state. In other words, if we turn over elected officials, but leave staffers and bureaucrats in place for 20 or 30 years, we empower staffers and bureaucrats. And by the way, also lobbyists. And so I'm concerned about term limits without also other limits on people who wield the power behind the scenes in Washington, D.C. So our term limits resolution is different than that proposed individually here in that it allows term limits for not just Congress, but for staffers, bureaucrats, and I think also importantly, the federal judiciary. All studies show that members of the federal judiciary, regardless of their political ideology or their jurisprudence when they enter the bench, the longer they're on the bench, the more they rule in favor of a wide and expansive federal government. And again, that makes sense. It's not evil, it's human nature in the sense that people who are part of a system that exercises expansive power, when they become part of that system and their pay is determined by that system, their staff is determined by that system, their power is determined by that system, they tend to favor that system. So I just wanted to make a distinction between the 2 types of term limits potentially proposed between these 2 resolutions. Second is imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government. This is fundamentally important. We just approved a $1.9 trillion spending package. Again, nobody in this room can even understand what 1.9 trillion is. It's actually, if you counted it in seconds, it's over 380,000 years. And so it's just an unbelievable amount of money, literally beyond human comprehension. And the country did it without batting an eye. They're now proposing a $4 trillion infrastructure package, again, imposing horrendous burdens on posterity. And we have an obligation to stand up to this. Wisconsin, again, has done that by signing on to a balanced budget amendment convention, but we need to go further than that. We need to impose further fiscal restraints on the federal government. Simple things that are supported by the American people, like imposing generally accepted accounting principles on the federal government. Believe it or not, if you sit down with the OMB, they will tell you that they use precisely no accounting principles. Literally, I've sat with senior members of the OMB and asked what accounting principles they use, and they say, well, we don't have any set of principles that guide our accounting. So in other words, we have fantasy accounting at the federal government. We can impose also taxation caps and spending caps through our resolution. And I think those are also important. We don't want to impose a balanced budget amendment on the federal government only to have them tax us out of existence here out in the states. Finally, we can impose scope and jurisdictional limits on the federal government. And I think this gets to the sweet spot of SJR 8 and why we're here today, really. The reason that we have people who like to stay in Washington, D.C. so long, and the reason we spend so much money in Washington, D.C. beyond our means is because we have given them too much power. And when I say we have given them too much power, I want to be very clear about who I mean when I say we. Primarily, I mean the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Our opponents will say that the Constitution of the United States is a beautiful and essentially perfect document and that we don't need to do anything to it. We just need to, quote unquote, enforce it. And I often ask which Constitution they're referring to when they say that. And I brought something with me today to show you what they're not referring to. They're referring to a pocket Constitution about 14 pages long. What I have in front of me, you can buy from the government publishing office for about $130. It's not the Constitution printed on gold leaf. It is the Constitution of the United States of America, the Centennial Edition from 2012, Government Publishing Office, 2,738 pages, actually over 3,000 pages with the supplements that go to this. This contains every case ever issued by the United States Supreme Court to tell us what a 14-page Constitution means. It's outrageous, and it has fundamentally changed the nature of the American system of governance. As one small example, or I should say large example, and Senator Senkowski brought this up earlier, it has given power to the federal government far beyond the enumerated powers. The Commerce Clause expansion by the Supreme Court has allowed the creation of the Department of Education, the Department of Energy, the Department of Congress, the EPA, the DEA, the FDA, things that the federal government was never intended to be involved in. Specifically going to the Department of Education, you can go back in our history and you can look at letters from Thomas Jefferson to William Henry Lee. Henry Lee asks Jefferson if he could get federal money for the University of Virginia, which he's founding. And Jefferson says, well, we can't do that because it's unconstitutional, essentially without an education amendment. I've read the amendments. You've probably read the amendments. There is no education amendment. The education amendment is contained here in this annotated Constitution created by the Supreme Court. There's a remedy that the founders gave to us that is the ultimate act of federalism. And that is that we in the states have the right to stand up against the federal government and say, enough is enough. We're going to put you back in the constitutional box. That's what we're asking you to do today with SJR 8. Today, over 30,380 people in the state of Wisconsin have signed a petition in support of SJR 8. They want the Wisconsin legislature to stand up and to become number 16 in the states out of the necessary 34 to call for a convention of states. The race is on, by the way. I just got notified by cell phone earlier sitting here in the committee hearing that West Virginia's Senate just passed their resolution on a voice vote and is headed over to the House. The people of this state overwhelmingly support you passing SJR 8. That is true in every district across the state. And we ask that you do so today, that you pass this out of committee. And I appreciate your time today, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Questions from the committee? Senator Senkowski.
When you said it would limit federal judiciary, are you talking about the Supreme Court?
It would be all of the federal judiciary is up for grabs, essentially the Supreme Court and the lower courts as created by Congress. Importantly, we can also limit the jurisdiction of the federal judiciary. And we could also limit the Supreme Court to 9 justices. There's been talk in Washington, D.C., pretty radical talk, in my opinion, these days, of packing the Supreme Court, of adding a bunch of justices. And we could impose a structural restraint on the federal government, limiting the Supreme Court to 9 justices only if we chose to do so.
And just a little bit of explanation I asked Senator Strogo. So none of this is in the resolution, term limit, the limit of the terms, everything. That would all be decided at the convention. Is that correct? Could you just walk through the process?
Sure, that is correct. The founders intended the convention process to be deliberative. The way the process works is when 34 states aggregate a call for convention, meaning that the convention calls are virtually the same, then a convention is called. Congress has a role, and the only role Congress has, as specified by the Constitution, is Congress names the time and place for the convention. And then their second role is they name the method of ratification. 2 are specified in the Constitution: ratification by state legislature, in other words, both houses here in your body, or by state ratifying convention. Interestingly, I hear some fear talk about state ratifying conventions. It's important to note it's not specified what that is in the Constitution. It's up to the state legislature to set what that is. Actually, a state legislature could say a state ratifying convention is the state legislature meeting in session. So once you get 34 states to call, then they gather in convention, what's called a general convention. General not meaning anything is up for discussion, meaning the things according to the call by the 34 states are up by convention. General meaning all 50 states can and likely will attend. Each state chooses a delegation. The state legislature, according to Federalist principles, will choose that delegation according to their own desires. And so you will send a delegation from here in Wisconsin. I'm often asked, well, how many will be in the delegation? Well, that's really up to you. But each state gets 1 vote. This is a convention of states, not a convention of delegates or a convention of populations. You'll send your delegation. The delegations will go to convention where and when it's called, and they will debate anything in these 3 subject matter areas. Likely they'll operate just like a legislature, break out into subcommittees and committees, and ultimately report back to the committee of the whole for vote on any proposed amendments. When any individual amendment or slate of amendments reaches a majority in the convention, then those can be to the states for ratification. Ratification requires ratification quarters of the states. It is a super majority. In fact, it is the highest bar in the system of U.S. governance. There is nothing higher than requiring 3/4 majority of the state legislatures to ratify an amendment. When it is ratified then by 38 states or 3/4 of states, it then becomes part of the United States Constitution. So that's the full summary of the process, Senator.
And just one more time for clarification, nothing can be discussed except for what is addressed in the resolution. Is that correct?
That is correct. So that becomes what the rules or the law or the boundaries of convention. And we know this because the convention, actually every state that calls for convention is passing the same resolution. They're agreeing in advance what the convention is. Anything that anyone would try to attempt to discuss that would be outside those bounds would be ruled non-germane and out of order in that convention.
And that would be one of the mechanisms to prevent what people are concerned about as far as the runaway?
That is correct. There are multiple mechanisms. One is just the actual call for convention that states are agreeing in advance. Number 2 is procedure at the convention and objections to anything that would be non-germane. Number 3 is it takes 26 states to get anything out of convention. Number 4, and frankly, the ultimate protection against the idea of a runaway convention is that it takes 38 states to ratify. And that means, importantly, that it takes only 13 states or 1 house in each of 13 states to stop anything from being ratified. And one of the things that I hear very often, I'm a very strong proponent of Second Amendment rights, and I hear we're going to lose our Second Amendment in a convention like this. I can tell you today there are 15 states where you can carry a long gun openly in a state legislature. There are 24 states where you can actually carry a handgun in the legislature. This is one of those states. And if you were to go into those states and suggest that the repeal of the Second Amendment be taken up, I would say you ought to be carrying a handgun because you're probably going to get chased out of those legislatures by armed legislators.
Thank you.
I'm here live in Philadelphia at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. When you hear the phrase lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, these are the folks we should think of, those who anonymously gave their lives. Well, today you have a chance to volunteer. You need to volunteer for conventionofstates.com, the movement that's going to save the country. These folks are willing to step up and give everything. We need you to give just a little bit. Go to conventionofstates.com and volunteer today.